The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the case that had gripped the nation finally came to a head. The tension in the air was palpable, with journalists, legal experts, and everyday citizens crowding into the gallery, eager to witness the moment that had been teased in headlines for weeks. At the center of it all was a figure of authority, seated high above the room, projecting an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. The proceedings had barely begun, yet a smirk tugged at the corners of his lips as if he already knew the outcome. Across from him, the individuals who had brought this case forward walked in, their presence commanding attention. Their movements were deliberate, their expressions unreadable. They had come armed with something the room did not yet know, but their quiet confidence suggested that what they carried could not be ignored. The murmurs in the audience died down as they took their places, ready to face off against a system that had, for too long, operated without question. The legal teams began their opening remarks, stating the nature of the accusations, but the authority presiding over the case barely seemed to listen. Instead, there was a casualness in his posture, a dismissive flick of his gaze, as if he saw this entire process as nothing more than a formality. It was clear that, in his mind, this would be another easy win, another challenge crushed before it had a chance to gain momentum. As the arguments unfolded, the individuals presenting their case remained composed, never faltering under the weight of the courtroom's oppressive atmosphere. Every point they made was backed with meticulous detail, yet time and again, the authority in the room waved them off, his responses laced with condescension. To him, this was all theater, a show put on by those who failed to understand the way the world truly worked. He let out small chuckles, almost as if he were amused by their persistence. Something shifted. The opposing side, which had spent the early part of the case carefully laying the foundation, now reached for something. A folder, a device, a piece of evidence. The moment it was introduced, the entire mood of the room changed. The authority who had once seemed so sure of himself suddenly tensed, his smirk wavering for the briefest of moments. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as the contents of this newly revealed proof were displayed. What had started as a case dismissed by those in power had now taken a sharp turn. The room, which had once seemed stacked in favor of the authority, now felt like it belonged to those who had brought this evidence forward. The faces of the legal teams on the opposing side darkened, their whispered discussions turning frantic. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong for those who had once believed themselves untouchable. A figure at the front took a step forward and began speaking with absolute precision. There was no hesitation in their voice, only facts, details, and an unshakable certainty. As the information unraveled, gasps echoed throughout the gallery. The expressions of those who had come expecting another predictable ruling shifted from curiosity to shock, then to something deeper, outrage. The authority at the center of it all leaned back, gripping the armrests of his seat a little too tightly. He tried to interject, to regain control of the room, but the evidence spoke louder than any denial he could muster. The opposing team pushed forward, not allowing him to brush aside the allegations. Not this time. They had come prepared for every dismissal, every excuse, every trick that had worked in the past. What was happening was no longer just a courtroom battle. It was a reckoning. The authority, once so sure of his power, was now being forced to sit and listen as his decisions, his actions, and his past were put under a microscope. Every word spoken chipped away at the illusion he had spent years maintaining. The people in the gallery, who had once watched in detached interest, now leaned forward, hanging on to every revelation. Despite the damning nature of the evidence, the man in power attempted to keep his composure. His responses grew sharper, his voice edged with frustration as he sought to undermine those confronting him. But it was no use. The evidence was irrefutable, and those presenting it knew it. For years there had been whispers, rumors of actions hidden behind legal jargon, of injustices that never saw the light of day. But now the truth was being laid bare piece by piece, in a way that could not be ignored. Those who had once dismissed the idea that such corruption could exist in such a high place were now forced to confront the reality of it. The room, once tilted in favor of those who believed they controlled it, had transformed into something else entirely. The authority, who had spent years wielding power without consequence, now found himself at the mercy of something far greater: the undeniable truth. The courtroom was filled to capacity, the air thick with anticipation. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, eager to witness a case that had captivated the nation. Legal analysts whispered among themselves, while reporters clutched their notepads, ready to document every word. At the center of it all sat a figure of authority, exuding confidence. The proceedings had barely begun, yet there was a sense of assuredness, as if the outcome had already been decided. Across the aisle, those who had brought the case forward entered with quiet composure. Their presence was unmistakable, their reputations preceding them. Unlike others who had stood in this courtroom before, they did not appear intimidated. Instead, there was a certainty in their movements, a quiet resolve that suggested they knew, something the rest of the room did not. The opening arguments commenced, each side laying the groundwork for what was to come. The authority overseeing the case listened with an air of detachment, as though indulging in unnecessary formality. The accusations were serious, but the responses to them were casual, dismissive. There was a practiced ease to it all, a confidence, built on years of experience in maintaining control. Yet something in the demeanor of those presenting the case remained steady. They did not falter under the dismissive tone or the condescending glances. Instead, they pressed forward, each statement supported by carefully gathered details. Their words carried weight, even if the authority in the room seemed unconcerned. Then the moment arrived. One of them reached into a folder, retrieved a document, and placed it before the courtroom. The shift was immediate. The once smug expression stiffened, the whispers in the audience turned to murmurs of curiosity. A single piece of paper, seemingly unremarkable at first glance, had changed everything. More evidence followed. A file was unlocked, a screen illuminated, a set of records displayed. The reactions in the gallery grew louder. The confidence that had once filled the space was now cracking, piece by piece. The authority who had controlled the narrative so effortlessly was now facing something impossible to ignore. One of them stepped forward and spoke with measured precision. Their words were not speculative, but absolute, backed by undeniable proof. There was no room for misinterpretation. What had been revealed was not a misunderstanding or a simple error. It was something far more deliberate, something that had been hidden beneath layers of legal protection for years. A shift rippled through the room. The spectators, many of whom had come expecting yet another predictable legal proceeding, were now leaning in, eyes wide. Gasps broke out as connections were drawn, as once hidden truths were brought into the light. Some in the gallery exchanged stunned glances, others hurriedly took notes, realizing the significance of what they were witnessing. Despite the mounting pressure, there was an attempt to maintain control. An effort was made to downplay the revelations, to steer the conversation away from the core issue. A challenge was issued, questioning the validity of the evidence, the intentions behind its presentation. But those standing in opposition were prepared. Every attempt to dismiss them was countered with hard facts, each evasion met with yet another undeniable revelation. The weight of the truth bore down on the room. Those who had once felt untouchable were now forced to confront the reality that had been laid before them. The walls that had long protected them were crumbling, and for the first time, it was clear that there would be no easy escape. The courtroom, once a place where power had been wielded without resistance, had become the setting for something far greater, a reckoning long overdue. The pressure had reached a boiling point. The weight of the revelations had shattered the illusion that things could continue as they always had. The courtroom battle was only the beginning. What followed was an outcry that echoed across the nation. Calls for justice grew louder, spreading far beyond the legal system itself. What had once been whispered in private conversations was now being shouted in the streets, written in headlines, and dissected on national television. As protests swelled, Outside government buildings, legal experts debated what would happen next. The evidence presented in court had already begun to unravel years of decisions, and now officials had no choice but to respond. Investigations were launched, each one uncovering deeper layers of misconduct that had long been buried beneath red tape and legal jargon. For those who had spent years benefiting from a system that protected the powerful, the reckoning was swift. Doors that had once been closed to scrutiny were now being forced open. Records were examined, testimonies reevaluated, and cases that had been dismissed without question were being pulled back into the light. Some of the most trusted figures in law and politics now found themselves under investigation, their past decisions no longer immune to challenge. The movement had gained unstoppable momentum. The individuals who had exposed the corruption did not let up. Instead, they pushed forward, demanding reforms that would prevent such abuses from happening again. Their message was clear. This was not just about one person or one case. It was about restoring faith in a system that had betrayed those it was meant to serve. Public figures who had once remained silent on such issues now spoke out, aligning themselves with the growing demand for change. Some did so out of genuine conviction, while others scrambled to distance themselves from a scandal they could no longer ignore. Politicians introduced new legislation aimed at increasing oversight, while watchdog organizations called for a complete overhaul of the processes that had allowed corruption to thrive unchecked. Meanwhile, those who had suffered under past rulings found themselves at the center of the conversation. Families who had lost everything due to unfair decisions, individuals who had been silenced by a system stacked against them, all now had a voice. Their stories flooded the media, each one reinforcing the urgent need for accountability. The idea that these were isolated incidents was no longer believable. The scope of what had been hidden was undeniable. The pressure extended beyond the legal system. Institutions that had once relied on public trust now faced their own questions. How had this been allowed to go on for so long? Who had known and done nothing? The fallout reached corporate boardrooms, law firms, and even universities, where past affiliations and endorsements were now under scrutiny. Despite attempts to shift the narrative, the truth could not be buried. Every effort to minimize the scandal was met with more evidence, more voices refusing to be silenced. The tide had turned, and those who had once felt untouchable were now answering for their actions. What had begun as a single case had transformed into something far greater. It was no longer about one courtroom battle, but about the fundamental need for justice. The system itself was being forced to change, not by those in power, but by the collective will of the people who refused to let corruption remain hidden any longer. The fallout from the courtroom revelations was swift and unrelenting. What had started as a case with limited public attention had now ignited a firestorm that no one could contain. In the wake of the damning evidence, pressure mounted from every corner. Legal experts, political leaders, and everyday citizens demanded action. The system, once viewed as an unshakable institution, was now being exposed for the flaws that had long been hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and power. Within days, official investigations were launched. Independent watchdogs began combing through past rulings, scrutinizing decisions that had once been accepted without question. Cases that had long been considered closed were suddenly reopened. Families who had suffered under questionable judgments saw a glimmer of hope, realizing they might finally get the justice that had been denied to them. Public outrage fueled the movement for accountability. Protesters gathered outside courthouses and government buildings, their voices growing louder with each passing day. What had begun as a single legal battle had transformed into a national reckoning, with people demanding deeper reforms to prevent such corruption from ever taking root again. Meanwhile, the media played a crucial role in exposing the extent of the wrongdoing. Investigative journalists unearthed hidden documents, tracking financial records that revealed a disturbing web of influence and favoritism. News anchors, once hesitant to address such issues, now led primetime discussions about how a system meant to uphold justice had instead been used to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Those who had once benefited from the way things were scrambled to protect themselves. Public statements were issued in an attempt to distance individuals and organizations from the scandal, but the damage had already been done. Trust had been broken, and there was no easy way to repair it. Every attempt to minimize the impact was met with renewed scrutiny as more voices stepped forward with their own experiences of injustice. The calls for reform went beyond one courtroom, one judge, or one case. Legal scholars and policymakers proposed sweeping changes aiming to close the loopholes that had allowed corruption to thrive. Transparency became the new demand. People wanted access to the inner workings of a system that had long operated behind closed doors. For those who had spent years fighting for fairness, the moment was both vindicating and frustrating. The truth was finally out, but the damage that had been done could not be undone overnight. There were lives that had been irreparably altered, decisions that had cost people their futures. The question now was whether those in power would be held accountable in a way that truly mattered. The courtroom battle had set a precedent, showing that even the most powerful could be challenged when armed with the truth. What came next would determine whether this was merely a temporary scandal or the start of a genuine shift toward justice. The courtroom battle had shattered the illusion of untouchable authority. What began as a single case had spiraled into something far greater, forcing an entire system to reckon with its failures. The revelations presented were no longer just accusations. They were undeniable proof that corruption had existed in plain sight for years, hidden behind complex legal jargon and institutional power. The aftermath left no room for silence. The wide public, once resigned to accepting the status quo, had found its voice. Across the country, citizens demanded accountability, their frustration spilling into protests, petitions, and public discourse. The once unwavering trust in the system had been broken, replaced with a newfound determination to root out corruption at every level. Investigations continued to unfold, revealing layers of misconduct that reached beyond what had been initially exposed. Each new discovery reinforced the same painful truth. Justice had not always been served fairly. People who had once been dismissed as conspiracy theorists or agitators were now being vindicated. The stories of those who had suffered unjustly were finally being heard, their experiences no longer buried beneath red tape and indifference. The impact of the case rippled far beyond the courtroom. Legal institutions were forced to implement reforms, corporations distanced themselves from those implicated, and political leaders who had once turned a blind eye were now compelled to take action. The scandal had become too big to ignore. No longer could power be wielded in secrecy. The people demanded transparency, and this time, they would not settle for empty promises. Yet, even as the walls of corruption began to crumble, there were those who resisted. The powerful rarely relinquish control without a fight, and efforts to suppress the momentum were inevitable. Discrediting campaigns, legal maneuvers, and media spin were deployed in an attempt to shift the narrative. But the truth had already taken root. The evidence had been laid bare, and no amount of damage control could erase what had been exposed. The battle for justice was not over, but the tide had turned. The case had proven that no one was above the law, not even those who had long believed themselves untouchable. It had shown that with persistence, courage, and undeniable proof, the truth could prevail. The question now was whether those in power had learned their lesson. Would real, lasting change come from this reckoning? Or would history repeat itself once the outrage subsided? That answer lay in the hands of the people, the ones who had demanded justice, who had refused to be silenced, and who had proven that, in the end, the truth was the most powerful.